So, for this week's episode, I have a story about a woman who was a pioneer throughout the Washington frontier starting in 1853. Unfortunately, I have no idea who she is. The only way that I know is that there was a story written in a book called The Souvenir of Western Women, written by Mary Osborn Douthit in 1905. And this woman is basically titled as a grandmother who wrote a journal of her early days in Washington as a pioneer. It was really an autobiography, but we have no idea who she is, which is the hardest thing because the point of this podcast is to highlight women, bring them to the surface, and highlight their lives and their accomplishments and just them in general. So this one's a little out of the ordinary because we don't know who she is, and unfortunately, we never will. But I think it would be a real disservice to not cover it in one of our episodes.
Hi, this is Sarah, and you're listening to another episode on Ladies First, Not Really.
It was 1853 and spring was full bloom when a 20-year-old woman and some friends decided to join a wagon train and move west. Most wagon trains migrating in the mid to late 19th century consisted of families and not single women, so she was uncommon and brave indeed. The identity of this woman is unknown, and her story was written as an autobiography titled A Grandmother's Story of Early Days in Washington, as part of the stories collected in The Souvenir of Western Women, written by Mary Osborn Douthit in 1905. Her story captures details of women's lives on the frontier and is most worthy of a retelling. She left her home in the spring of 1853. We're not sure where her home was. And by October, the wagon train arrived in Mound Prairie, Thurston County in Washington State. To survive the colder weather months, the party moved into a small one-roomed cabin designed for bachelors. Yikes. But were able to create makeshift apartments for 10 people using their wagon covers. During the holidays in 1854, a couple nearby hosted a Christmas dinner in their small floorless side kitchen. The dinner included beans, gingerbread, and coffee. Now, women did not have property rights at that time. So she was told if she got married, then she would get 180 acres of land. As she recalled, so of course I got married and got my land. I mean, what else was she going to do? They settled down and built a 2-room log cabin. They only had a bed, stove, and some dishes, but no furniture was available to purchase. This did not deter her. However, she was really resourceful, so her husband made a table with several split boards, and she made stools. She created cushions with moss and covered them with oil calico. She made a rocking chair out of a sugar barrel with the same moss cushioning and cupboards. She was very proud of her homestead they had created, and she loved to entertain folks in the area. Now, at one point in 1855, they heard of a war that broke out between the Indians to the east of the Cascade Mountains. The neighbors built a fort in preparation, and by the time it was completed, word came around that the Indians were coming towards them. So the settlers moved to the fort where they stayed 16 months. Okay, now let's take a minute to appreciate this situation. The fort was a large one-room building, and it's assumed it was enclosed by a fenced barricade made with tree trunks as we've seen in the Western movies. Can you imagine quickly uprooting, hastily grabbing whatever you can, and moving into like a community center with your nearest neighbors and their families for 16 months? No air conditioning, no real heat, no indoor plumbing. I mean, that's just brutal. Imagine getting the call and leaving your comfortable log cabin and your moss cushioned stools and now inhabiting this one-room building with 30 other families. Some were from Centralia and Bush Prairie, so you weren't close to them at all. You may not have even known them. They could have been virtually strangers. The only separation from each other was a partition. You have no idea how long you'll be in such close living quarters with these same families, but it ends up being almost a year and a half. No bathrooms, showers, Running water and deodorant did not exist except a spritz of lavender water. Okay, back to the story. Even though the families were in such close quarters, they all got along wonderfully well. The author said, "I suppose we were afraid the Indians would kill us, and we wanted to die in peace with all mankind." What if you were stuck in there with family and the Dennis the Menace child of your neighbor who you couldn't stand, and the only thing separating you was a partition? No privacy, your kids running wild. I can't even imagine. After 16 months, the war was over and they returned to their homes. In the summer of 1858, she and her husband decided to move to Gray's Arbor, located on the Olympic Peninsula on the Pacific coast. They sold all of their possessions except what they could fit in canoes, and they set off for their new home site. In July of 1859, she and her new community prepared to celebrate their first 4th of July in the county's history. On that beautiful summer day, about 20 of them gathered their baskets and babies and met on a slough, which is a wetland where a riverbed once ran. They all gathered into a wooden boat with square ends called a scow. They spent the day singing patriotic songs with Old Glory flying in the breeze. She had 4 children by this time, and this is the same year the first election was held at Westport. The author wanted to attend the election, so she, her husband, their 4 children, and a few others started out early in the morning, loaded into a sailboat, and headed to James Rock. Now, the trip was smooth until they lost the tide about half a mile to shore, where they planned to stop at James' cabin. As a determined woman she was, instead of waiting 6 hours for the tide to come back, she was determined to wade the rest of the way. So into the water she went, from ankle to waist deep. I can only imagine that heavy skirt, which already weighed like 10 to 20 pounds, most likely felt like 50 pounds heavier, that it was wet, and it was probably floating above her as she's trying to wade into the water. The men took a baby apiece and brought them all to shore. Her husband tried to carry her, but her proven determination would not allow it. Once they made it, they dried out and waited for the tide to come in. They continued their journey, and once they got to the polls, they would not let her vote. Women were not allowed to vote in the state of Washington until the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. I mean, what a punch in the face. You had to take a canoe, wade through like half a mile of water just to get to shore to be told you can't vote. Door shut in your face. Oh my gosh. I mean, after that incredible journey, just to cast her vote, to be turned away. But in her resolve, the author firmly stated, "Don't tell me that women can't go to the polls," because she got there all right through sailing, waiting half a mile, waiting 6 hours for the tide, and then sailing some more. It is now springtime in Gray's Arbor in 1860. She knows that they had lost all of their money, but did not elaborate as to the situation. So, finding themselves in dire straits, the author's husband went to work for the mines on the Salmon River, also in Gray's Arbor. After gold had been found in California in 1859, miners started panning on the Salmon River, where the first hard rock gold was found in 1860. After that, several hard rock gold mines popped up along the river, with the Live Yankee mine being the first. Her husband worked at Live Yankee mine since Bear Creek mine didn't open until late summer that year. While her husband was gone, she was left alone in their cabin with her children. As it was on the frontier, neighbors were 10 miles away with nothing but the beautiful landscape as far as could be seen. When her husband came back from the mines, they decided to move up the Chehalis River and build a homestead. Her husband and his brother-in-law had been batching, as she puts it, in a small cabin on the new land. On one of his trips to their current house, she decided she was going with him. He tried to convince her the house was too small, but she said, "That makes no difference. Where you live, I can live, and I am going." So she did. On the 3rd of July, 1860, they moved to their new cabin situated in the woods. They put their things up, ate dinner, and then her husband left for 3 days to bring the cattle back in. Being alone was a terrifying experience for her, and it would be injustice to not tell it in her own words. She says, "With no lock on the door and holes in the chimney, darkness was coming on. I put the children to bed and sat down to read a chapter in the Bible. All at once the wild cats began to screech, the owls to woo-hoo, and the wolves to howl. I jumped into bed almost frightened to death. I believe that the only time in my life I wished to die. I just asked the Lord to take me and the dear little ones straight up to heaven before we were all eaten up by wild animals." Away in the night, something began to pat on the floor, and make a squeaky noise. I just lay still, afraid to breathe. Next morning, I looked to see if my hair was white. This lasted for 2 more nights, but it was all noises of the wild and no real danger. I think it's hard for us to really appreciate being completely alone in the woods. I mean, yeah, some of us live out in the middle of nowhere, but this was wild territory. There were no property lines. There was no one to call. I mean, you were on your own. So for this poor woman who just arrived and then was there for maybe a day, and her husband up and leaves, and she's there with her kids by herself, I'm sure it was very quiet. Every noise was accentuated. And I can only imagine how scary it must have been. Now, they were still living in a small bachelor cabin, but they did not have the funds for enough lumber to build a proper house. So she decided to sell her gold watch and chain, one that she undoubtedly brought with her when she first ventured across the plains. Her husband wouldn't have it and objected to her giving it up. For settlers in these days, luxury items were not easily replaced, so this was a big sacrifice for her. They ran into a man who owned a sawmill, and he agreed to provide the lumber needed for the watch. So she sold it, and they built their home. She recalled happiness as they worked and waited for it to be completed. This courageous woman loved being a pioneer and recalls those days being filled with happiness. The doctors were few on the frontier in the 19th century, so people were on their own if they got sick. They mostly relied on homeopathic remedies that were tried and true for generations. She recalled making a tea of wild cherry and dogwood bark, and recalled with humor that once the first doctor came to town, people began to get sick and have needed a doctor since. When our author was in her later years, her fighting spirit would come out when newcomers would criticize the, quote, old mossbacks, as they called them, for not doing things a certain way in the early days. She sarcastically recalled not knowing how the newcomers would have gotten there without the old mossbacks. I could only imagine her sarcasm and wit would have been amazing to witness. It's unknown when she died or her age, but we'll close this amazing woman's life story full of adventure, experiences that we can't hardly imagine today, and the legacy she left behind. As she neared the end of her life, she said, quote, "God bless old pioneers, and may they all go to heaven when they die. There are a few of them left to tell the story. Some of us are left to see the wilderness blossom as the rose. I know it is evening time with me, and my work is almost done. I am watching and waiting." I wish so badly that I knew who this woman was. To just put a name to this incredible story, even have an opportunity to have just her face, picture of her, I bet she was so awesome. She was so determined and so brave. And I just wish I could have sat down with her for a few minutes and just talked about her life. But since that can't be, I'm really happy that we have at least this writing from her that talks about her life and her experiences on the frontier. And how awesome that she constantly recalled just having happiness. She didn't complain about their situation, the fact that she had this tiny cabin for a long time. She had stools cushioned with moss. She loved every minute of it. And it's women like her that deserve their time in the spotlight. Just talking about all that she went through to try to get to the polls, couldn't even vote. sold her gold watch that was probably a very valuable possession to her just to get the lumber for her home. And she was willing to sacrifice as well to take care of her family. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Till next time.
For more information, visit my blog at rebelliouscorsets.com.